you very much. And can I just check that we can all hear at the back?
Yes.
Good, good. And it is a pleasure to come back here to New Horizons and to deliver another talk. Always a pleasure to come along here and to deliver this talk, the Philadelphia Experiment. And as I'm sure most of you who are familiar with this know, it's a real controversial subject and it's a complicated subject. It's as simple as that. Very, very complicated. The Philadelphia Experiment has often been called a myth, it's been called a legend, it's been called a story that's definitely untrue, it's a hoax and all the rest of it, and maybe that's true. But whatever you want to mention about the Philadelphia Experiment, and when people talk about it, it's one of these that really you have to judge for yourself. I mean, I am going to attempt to give some sort of overview as I understand this subject. I gave this talk in Wigan a few months ago, and the people who were listening had never heard this version. So in other words, there must be different versions and different angles to the story. I first really got interested or re-interested in this subject, the Philadelphia Experiment, was when I was doing a talk a few years ago at Probe on synchronicity. A few of you might remember it, and I later did that talk, the synchronicity talk, here at New Horizons, and in fact we filmed it, James, didn't we? We've got DVDs on it. If anybody never bought one at the time, I've got plenty in the bag and in the car if you're ever interested in that subject. It was a controversial subject, but it was an interesting subject. But when I gave the talk on synchronicity at Probe, it was only when I'd given that talk that after the talk I was rummaging round the bookshelves at the back, just idly looking at various books like I always do. I've got a massive library at home, and I came across this book here, Charles Berlitz and William Moore, The Philadelphia Experiment. And I smiled when I saw that book, because it wasn't the first time I come across it. I'd read this book years ago, and this subject of the Philadelphia Experiment I first came across over 40 years ago when I was reading and studying the works of Albert Einstein. So when I saw this book again, I did have to smile to myself, and I thought, well, I will buy the book and just to reread it and familiarise myself again with what really is a mystery story. It's as simple as that. It's a mystery story, and it's difficult to get to grips with, really, is the Philadelphia Experiment. The Philadelphia Experiment is a name given to a naval military experiment which supposedly took place in the Philadelphia Naval Dockyard in October 1943, where it is alleged the American Naval Destroyer Escort vessel, the Eldridge, was to be rendered invisible, in other words, cloaked to enemy devices. And it has been called a myth. It had a name of Project Rainbow. The experiment was called Project Rainbow. It's looked on as a hoax. The Navy, American Navy, denied that the experiment ever took place, but really it has captured imaginations basically ever since 1943. And as Charles Berlitz said, the co-author of that book, it is an incident that is so unusual in terms of accepted scientific possibility that it's utterly incredible. I mean, an experimentation in invisibility in 1943 on a ship over 300 feet long, weighing over 1,250 tons displacement. It is a staggering prospect. The experiment was supposedly based on the unified field theory, which is a term that Einstein coined to explain or unite gravitation with electromagnetism. All very complex. And as I understand it, the whole idea was that the Eldridge, the ship, would be fitted out with large generators, and the whole idea was to try to produce enough power to create like an optical invisibility, a unified field theory, or a magnetic current to give a force field around the ship to render that ship invisible. Fantastic in wartime, if that could be done. So it was really done for defence purposes. Testing apparently took place in the summer of 1943, in July 1943, where it is said that the Eldridge, caused by a series of electrical magnetic fluctuations, became invisible. People who was on board the ship said they witnessed some sort of green fog coming down on the ship, and they said that the seamen on board the ship, they felt nauseous, they experienced nausea, disorientation, definitely sickness and wanting to vomit, and it had these side effects. And some people say that when the fog lifted, some of their colleagues were embedded into the ship's hull, all sorts of horrible side effects, and at that point the experiment was stopped, or it was changed to a new experiment which was basically to render the ship invisible to radar. That's what the experiment decided to become, as a means of deterrent against radar, to protect itself against radar. That's what the idea was after those horrible side effects. But apparently the experiment was repeated in October of 1943, where this time not only the ship was said to become invisible, but apparently when the ship got back into the Philadelphia dockyard, in a blue flash of light, it suddenly disappeared from the Philadelphia dockyard and apparently teleported over to Norfolk, 200 miles away, and then back again, reappearing in exactly the same spot where it vanished, and the elapsed time is only a matter of minutes. And people say, or accounts say, that the ship really went back in time about 10 seconds. So because of all this controversy, there's been many accounts of the story of the Philadelphia experiment, and most of the stories are really about the effects on the crew, because again the crew was nauseous, they were sick and they were disorientated, and all these sudden side effects, and people talked about people vanishing, walking through walls, all the rest of it. And because of these after effects, these side effects, it looks like the experiment was stopped and abandoned in 1943, really because of the side effects, and never to be repeated again. Some of the people who said they served aboard the Eldridge underwent brainwashing by the Navy to say, really, the experiment never took place, we want to forget it, and all the rest of it, and that was the end of the story in 1943. So the Navy started to deny the experiment ever took place. The question, I think, that remains for me is, was the Navy involved in 1943 during the war in a top secret experiment that sadly went wrong? In other words, this invisibility cloaking device that suddenly went wrong, and this after effects of like this teleportation suddenly occurred with all these disastrous side effects. That is the question that we are left with when we look at this subject. Was these side effects, was it true, was it false? You hear all these stories, and there are many accounts of it going on. The problem is with all this, the accounts really start, the stories really start with a man who was a mystery in himself. And that was a man who was a scientist called Morris Jessup. He was a mystery man, and this is really where the story starts. Because Morris Jessup, he was an astronomer, he was an astrophysicist, he was also a mathematician, and he was a researcher. And when he left high school, he joined the army and he became a sergeant. He became a sergeant, and when he left the army, he studied and became a scientist. Morris Jessup went working in the early 20s in South Africa as an astronomer. He went working as an astronomer, and even though he never actually was awarded a PhD, they always called him Dr. Jessup. He became famous and he was called Dr. Jessup. He later went working in Brazil, and then he drifted over to into Central America to study the Mayan culture, and then he drifted down into South America to study the ruins in Peru, the Incas, and all the rest of it. And it was when he was working in Peru that he really came to a startling conclusion. He said when he was studying all these ancient ruins, and that looking at these massive stones, and also considering the advanced building techniques, and coupled with the fact that he thought that the people who built these massive constructions, it couldn't have been the people building them by hand or with animals as just a helper. They were too involved, too big, massive constructions, and something special was needed. And like von Daniken, years later, he put forward the idea that these advanced, massive structures must have been built by some other types of people, not the Incas, but some other types of people using some sort of levitating devices, maybe operated from skyrships of some sort. Morris Jessup was one of the first people to put forward the idea of the ancient astronaut theory. We hear it all the time now about ancient astronauts and all the rest of it, but Jessup who is long forgotten in many circles, was one of the first to put forward that idea. And we're all familiar with the von Daniken bit. He brought out those books about the ancient astronauts and all the rest of it, but really we've got to spare a thought for Maurice Jessup, because he was one of the first to put forward that idea, and von Daniken jumped on that a bit later and produced his £1,000,000 bestsellers, the books. But Maurice Jessup was one of the first to propose that idea of the ancient astronaut theory. The problem for Maurice Jessup was he was funding his own expeditions to Central and South America to look at all these ancient ruins and study them, and when his money ran out, well, he couldn't get funding for his experiments, so he finished up going back to the States back in 1954. And when he arrived back in the States, that was during, really, the UFO phenomenon that cropped up in the 40s and 50s. And we're all familiar, really, how that got underway, because to me, it all started with that sighting of Kenneth Arnold's in June 1947, and I think we all remember that one, don't we? The 1947 Kenneth Arnold sighting, where he was flying his plane around Mount Rainier in Washington State, and he claimed he saw 9 crescent-shaped objects flying around Washington State. And that was one of the first sightings in the 40s, June 47. It's always been emblazoned on my mind, the Kenneth Arnold story, because when he was asked what did he see that day, bright clear day, he said, I saw some 9 strange objects, and they said, describe it. He said, all I can say, it was like saucers skimming over a pond. And that's how he described it. And because of that description, we got the whole idea of the flying saucer, which then became famous, and these were what sparked off this flying saucer episodes in America in the 40s and 50s. Even though they've been around a lot longer than that, to me it was the Kenneth Arnold sighting in 47 that seemed to spark off the rest of the sightings. When Maurice Jessup got back to America in 1954, this craze was carrying on through the 40s and 50s, and he studied the UFOs and the sightings of the day, and he came to the conclusion that really these sightings of the UFOs and the unidentified flying objects, all the rest of the flying saucers, were linked to all these ancient structures that he was studying down in South America. And so he decided he would write a book. And in 1955, Maurice Jessup published his first book, his first of 3 books, and it was The Case for the UFO that he published in 1955. That book you can still buy, but it's a hell of a price. So, and it's difficult to get hold of, but you can buy it if you're prepared to pay the money. He published that book, The Case for the UFO, in 1955, and when he published that book, it basically led to a train of events that's really led to a controversy that's basically raised ever since 1955, when Jessup published his book, The Case for the UFO. And it has raised ever since and caused consternation, because in that book he describes and discusses the possible propulsion systems of the flying saucers. And he says he thinks that there was some sort of anti-gravity devices must have been used, some sort of electromechanical devices used to create some sort of force field, electromagnetism, to create a force field. He said that would be the only way you could account for some of the erratic behaviour of the UFO sightings that he'd witnessed in America and everybody else were witnessing. And he said it's got to be something to do with anti-gravity and these electromagnetic forces causing the force fields. He was convinced of that. And he was one of the first to put forward the idea that not only the sightings that was being seen in America in the 40s and 50s, but even going back to ancient and prehistoric times. And he was one of the first to put forward the controversial theory that these possible space beings were our God that had left the Earth millions of years ago. It was all very controversial. And when he published his book, The Case for the UFO, in 1955, it was so controversial. This is when Maurice Jessup received the first of 3 letters. In 1955, he received a letter, and this letter was basically talking about his book he'd just published, and it was talking about various issues. And what the letter was basically saying to Maurice Jessup was, this idea, Mr. Jessup, that you've got about levitating devices being used for these ancient structures in Central America and South America was basically true, Mr. Jessup. He was basically saying you were right. You might have been a guess, but you were right in what you were thinking, because levitation has been used for thousands of years in past societies on Earth, but it's a process long forgotten. But you were basically right in what you're talking about. And it gave the idea that the bloke who wrote this first letter knew what he was talking about. He signed the letter Carlos Miguel Allende. And that was the signature on the letter. The letter was very controversial because the letter was written in a scrawled hand. It was written in different coloured inks. The capitals were all in the wrong place. There were misspellings and mispronunciations. The letter was odd in itself. And then it was signed, this Carlos Miguel Allende, with these references to levitating ideas basically being true. So it was a letter that when Maurice Jessup received that letter, staggered him really. So obviously he wrote back for further details. He heard nothing for months. And while he was waiting for the letter, he was preparing a second book, which was the UFO and the Bible. And while he was preparing his second book, he went on a lecture tour with Maurice Jessup. He went on a lecture tour and he was lecturing about the book and these propulsion systems and the unidentified flying objects. And he was also telling the audience, for the people who would listen, that we in America were wasting our time spending money on rocket propulsion systems and research. He said we're wasting our time because in space travel it is no use whatsoever. We should spend our money on studying Einstein's theory, the unified field theory. By studying Einstein's unified field theory, he said they would give us the answers, and through that we would find a better form of travel, a faster form of travel, which will be invaluable in space travel at a fraction of the cost. He said we should be campaigning to the government to say, forget rocket propulsion systems, study Einstein's unified field theory. In that, we will get the answers to cheap travel and instantaneous travel. Fantastic in space exploration. Because of these lectures, apparently the bloke who wrote that first letter, Carlos Miguel Allende, was in the audience. And it prompted him, when he heard these lectures, to write a second letter. And he wrote a second letter, dated 1956, which he wrote to Maurice Jessup. And I have got the gist of this letter, which I want to read to you now to make sure we don't miss anything out. And this is the letter, the second letter, the gist of a very complicated letter because of all the misspellings written in coloured inks and all the mispronunciations. But this was the gist of the letter. Wrote January the 13th, 1956. He says to Jessup, demanding study in Einstein's unified field theory is not necessary because Einstein stopped the work, not because of mathematics, but because mankind would misuse it, and the theory was incomplete. He said, yet Bertrand Russell, the mathematician and philosopher, said it was complete, but man was not ready for it until after World War III. Very controversial letter. Yet my friend, Dr. Franklin Reno, now that's a name that's important, I want you to keep in your mind. He said, yet my friend, Dr. Franklin Reno, did some work on an aspect of the unified field theory and produced workable results the Navy wouldn't use because of fear. And Dr. Franklin Reno's results show proof up to a point that the unified field theory is right. But to go beyond that point would be foolish. As for levitation, as said before, it has been done, and due to this work, the result was complete invisibility of a ship and all its crew while at sea in October 1943. The electromagnetic field was effective in a spheroidal shape around the ship. Any person within that sphere became vague in form, walked on nothing. Any person outside that sphere, all they could see nothing but the shape of the ship's hull in the water. A lot of the crew during this experiment went mad. Some finished up in a frozen state, so force field work is problematic, Mr. Jessup. These men talked about the events and after effects 10 years later, with statements like, going into deep freeze, caught in the flow, stuck in the green.